This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, let us welcome to the seminar Professor John Marriot. John has been explaining some aspects of his, not so much career as retirement, to me downstairs, in that I was cheeky enough to ask what took him from London to Howden in the East Riding. And he explained that he moved there for a house to renovate and live in, and having gone to Howden, not only fell in love with Howden, but set out to write its history as part of the VCH East Riding. Less happily, you are now resident in Didcot.
Yes.
One would never say that Didcot is a place without history.
Perish the thought, no.
But I fear it is not quite the same as Howden. But
It's got a railway centre. What more do you want?
it's a railway junction, yes.
No, a centre, a steam railway centre.
Oh, the steam railway centre, indeed. Could the Friends of Didcot just be quiet?
Allow the auction this
We're here to discuss Yorkshire, yes. So, on this occasion, we're happy to have John, and he is going to describe to us some of his new research arising from VCH Howdenshire. And your title is Land Drainage of East Riding Wetlands.
Yes, that's right.
So, John.
Yes, thanks very much, Richard. It's a real pleasure to be here. But a prologue. Richard has already told you some of the background to this. My previous research and teaching has been concerned almost exclusively with metropolis and empire. So you can imagine, I hope, something of the departure that work on the Victoria County history of Howdenshire was. Had somebody told me 2 years ago when I embarked upon this work that I would become animated by questions of land drainage, or even that I would give a talk on land drainage at the Institute of Historical Research, I would have said they were bonkers. But it has happened, and here I am, and I'm really pleased to be here. The story of land drainage of Howdenshire is an extraordinarily long one, going back well over a millennium, and there's no way in the next 30 minutes or so that I can begin to tell you all of that story. So I want to concentrate, for my reasons probably more than yours, because this is part of the story that I feel less confident with. I really want to concentrate upon the early period, leading up until the 18th century, before parliamentary reform started to kick in. In many respects, for an area such as Howdenshire, does everybody know where Howdenshire is? I've actually done some maps for those people. I haven't done that many because, to tell you the truth, I wasn't expecting more than a handful of people here.
Only people from Didcot can have a map. They particularly need to have Yorkshire explained to them.
For an area such as Howdenshire, flanked as it is by the Derwent, the Ouse and the Humber, draining and embankment of land was probably more important to the development of its rural hinterland than enclosure. Indeed, I would want to argue that enclosure was often a necessary prelude to the implementation of such improvement schemes. At a time when the drainage of fens and marshes emerged as a matter of national importance in the 17th century, great William Dugdale, inquired somewhat rhetorically, "The most civilized nations have, by so much art and industry, endeavoured to make the best improvement of their wastes, commons, and all sorts of barren land, amongst which advantages that of enclosure has not been the least. If then the mere enclosure and tillage of that which naturally yielded little profit doth deserve so great a commendation, how much more is the skill and pain of those be had in esteem who have recovered many vast properties of land totally overwhelmed with a deluge of waters." So what Dugdale is arguing here, I think with a certain degree of justification, is that drainage and schemes of land drainage were vitally important to the development of so many areas of England. Given the low-lying nature of the terrain in Howdenshire, much of it little above the level of the Humber, and its proximity to major waterways, drainage and embankment really stood at the heart of land improvement from the early medieval period, possibly even before that. The earliest evidence from Howdenshire dates back before the 9th century, when the course of the Derwent was changed away from Howden and directly into the Ouse. Indeed, the fact that so many villages and hamlets have names which are Danish or Anglian in origin suggests to me that the peoples were able to embank the Humber, Ouse and the lower Derwent over a fairly lengthy period before the conquest. The recording of prosperous manors and much cultivated ground in Domesday testifies not only to the continued success of settlements, but to the establishment of others. Skelton, Saltmarsh, Cotness and Yokefleet were all recorded between 959 and 1066. Reclamation of the 100, however, was demonstrably extended by Hugh de Puyset after his appointment as Bishop of Durham in 1153. In addition to undertaking his own schemes, such as that to construct a dyke from the fields of Eastrington to the Ouse, the bishop granted parcels of land to his mates and officials, who then vigorously reclaimed marshland areas through drainage and embankment. One such recipient was the good Gilbert Hansard, who was granted a portion of Blacktoft and set about the improvement of the estate. The drain he built was one of 3 important drains running in parallel, really like fingers from the Forney to the Humber, all of which can be traced back to the late 12th century. Thornton Dam was constructed by the canons of Thornton Abbey in Lincolnshire, who owned land around Faxfleet, Hansard, presumably by Hansard sometime between 1165 and 1185, and Temple Dam was constructed probably by the Knights Templar, who held Faxfleet and a significant portion of land around Faxfleet as early as 1185. Watermills were erected at the southern ends of these channels, suggesting one of the reasons for their construction, but they also served as drains for land through which they passed. By the early 14th century, the reclamation of Howdenshire was well advanced, and most of the fertile silt land brought into agricultural use. But the record was uneven, and part of the reason for this was that the land was really quite diverse. In addition to land near the Ouse, which was silt land and reasonably fertile, you had large areas of what can be described as marshlands, which were extraordinarily difficult to drain successfully. The most important of these was a marshland area called Wallingfen, an area of 2,000 to 3,000 acres, just a mile or two north of the Humber. And I don't think there's any doubt in my mind that the ditches and dikes that I've already talked about, Thornton, Hansard Arm and Temple, were all constructed as a means of helping to drain this important area. But although Wallingfen had benefited from the construction of these ditches, the partial draining of Bishop Soil, another large marshy area to the west of Wallingfen, had also been drained. Less improvement was seen in some of the outlying marshland areas. Reclamation through improved drainage, however, made possible the siting of other small settlements, including Greenoak, Cotness, Spen, Gilberdyke, Borcombe, Thorntoft and Metham. 5 new hamlets appeared in Howden Manor in the century after Doomsday along the raised banks of the Hansard Arm and Temple Dam, with a further 12 south of the east line joining Howding and Eastrington. So you can see that's actually, although the settlements were small, their developments paints a rather complex picture, but one to my mind which is linked very strongly to particular patterns of land reclamation. The increasingly elaborate network of rivers, ditches and embankments needed, however, constant attention. It was never the case that you could build a ditch and then just leave things to get on with themselves. And yet the problem was that in maintaining the effectiveness of these ditches and embankments, there was really no ready means of enforcing people to do so. Early in the 12th century, Henry I had introduced a code of law for marshlands and established customs governing the maintenance of sewers and ditches. Incidentally, sewers at that time didn't have a modern meaning. Sewers referred to any sort of watercourses. Only later in the early modern period did sewers come to be linked almost exclusively to the transport, conveyance and dispatch of effluent material. The Code of Henry I provided for the constitution of juries, acting under the authority of sheriffs or justices to survey land and order repairs and cleansing where necessary. But since most of the land was in private hands or of uncertain ownership, and therefore subject to repeated contestation, enforcement was often difficult, if not impossible. There were also problems attendant on precisely what the medieval state considered to be a priority in its programme of public works. Overall, I think I'm right in saying that rivers and roads tended to present rather more pressing and rather different problems for the medieval state. Monarchs had long recognised the need to preserve their kingdoms, not only against foreign invasions, but also against the ravages of the sea and flooding from streams and rivers, thus providing subjects with unhindered passage over the roads and bridges of the land. Rivers, therefore, were considered vital arteries, and so any interference in their security and free passage was a threat to trade and agriculture, and in some cases to the drainage of fenland regions. The maintenance of rivers was thus viewed as a matter of urgent public concern, which frequently attracted the attention of the king. Here, a more efficient legal mechanism was put in place through which presentments detailing particular problems were made to justices and jurors of the relevant hundred, which then ordered remedial action under threat of financial penalties, or in more extreme cases, imprisonment. If within this regime of public works it appeared that anxieties over the state of drainage were subordinated to the needs of river navigation, this may also be because an additional and complementary system designed to maintain ditches and sewers had already been set in place. As early as the mid-13th century, the King and Chancery created an apparatus to appoint a continuing series of commissions of inquiries before they were finally superseded 200 years later by what became known as the Permanent Court of Sewers. Howdenshire and its environments witnessed a long series of such commissions set up to address the more urgent problems attendant on the disrepair of essential defences, normally by holding to account negligent landowners and townspeople, or by settling disputes over rights to watercourses. I mean, there's nowhere I can list all of these. Most of them are detailed quite nicely in Dugdale, who did the work on this. But let me give you one example by way of illustration. During the 1380s and 1390s, a series of initiatives were taken to repair the banks of Howdenshire between the Ouse and the Derwent. Commissioners were directed and empowered to, quote, proceed therein according to the law and custom of England, and also impressed so many diggers and other labourers as they should think fit to employ in that work, allowing them competent wages in regard of the urgent necessity for the expediting thereof. So these commissions actually had considerable power, legal and economic power, because they had, certain, amongst other things, the power to employ labour to get the necessary work done. Then in 1399, under Lawrence de Althorpe, Sir Thomas Metham and others, a commission was given responsibility of inspecting and repairing the banks, ditches and sewers between Pocklington and the Ouse and Derwent, a task which covered really quite a considerable amount of land and was extraordinarily complex and comprehensive in its scope. Having surveyed the area, the commissioners issued wide-ranging orders to numerous local landowners to repair the watercourses which traversed their land. Those so charged included many knights of the realm and powerful local figures, so that nobody was above the law in this respect. Sir Thomas Metham himself was required to repair, even though he was a member of the commission, was required to repair those on his land from Stockholm to Metham Ing and Constable Ing. Sir Robert Constable, Lord of the Manor of Home in Spalding Moor, was ordered to repair the whole of Langdyke watercourse from Constable Ing to the Humber to a breadth of 12 foot and a depth of 6 foot. Richard Hansard, no doubt a descendant, had to clear Blacktoft Dam, otherwise Hansard Dam, to a breadth of 16 foot and a depth of 8 foot. These ditches were considerable in size. I mean, most of them remain to the present, and David Crouch, who was working with me on the Howdenshire volume, I mean, we walked along some of these dikes, and fascinating that exercise was. The Abbot of Thornton was directed to repair, cleanse and maintain Langdyke from Scalby to the Ouse under penalty of distraint by all of his lands, and so on and so forth. Despite the sheer ambition of the task undertaken, some of the problems clearly addressed by the Commission proved intractable and before long required further attention. In 1407, commissioners were appointed to survey the banks of the Humber and Ouse from the Derwent to Hessel, near Hull. At a meeting held in Howden, they heard complaints about the ancient common sewer Old Derwent, which reached the Derwent in a southerly direction, passing through Nedlington, Asselby and Barnby, and to the north through Newsom, Lofthoff and Spaldingmore. Stretches of the sewer had fallen into disrepair and had been obstructed by inhabitants of the towns through which it passed, causing it to overflow and cause great damage to adjacent land. The inhabitants were therefore ordered to repair the sewer to a breadth of 8 foot and to a depth of 6 foot. The important point about this was that not only shows the transient nature of even the most ambitious schemes and how often the repairs that were enforced at the time were found to be wanting, but also the extent to which the popular intruded into the maintenance of such public works. There are numerous instances cited by Dugdale of people who basically took the law into their own hands in order to, for example, to provide better irrigation for their particular land, dammed some of the ditches in going directly against the recommendations of the commissioners. In the course of the 15th century, at least 29 such commissions were appointed to inquire into recurring problems relating to land in Yorkshire as a whole. Of these 29, no less than 19 were directed to the banks, sewers and ditches of Howdenshire and to the immediate environment. For the most part, the extensive commons draining into the Derwent, Ouse and Humber. None of the commissions surveyed the eastern part of the East Riding. The record here suggests to me anyway that the commissions, backed by the state and comprising many of the wealthiest landowners, were powerful bodies which over a period of probably about 250 years or so were able to mitigate the worst of the problems experienced by Howdenshire. The natural terrain, however, continued to pose challenges, as did the local populace, prepared to take drainage and supply of water into its own hand. But what the commissioners did, I think, was help to create and maintain favourable conditions of the commons, most notably Bishop's Soil and Wallingfen. In the 16th century, in the Tudor period, we enter into a qualitatively and quantitatively new phase of land drainage and its maintenance. Because under Henry VIII, the administrative machinery was consolidated under a statute in 1531 introduced by Henry VIII and called the Statute of Sewers Act. This effectively replaced the rather ad hoc nature of the Crown Commissions with a body which became known as the Permanent Commissioner of Sewers, which remained in place for the next 400 years. Now, I'd come across Commissioner of Sewers before, but almost exclusively in a metropolitan context. I mean, I'd read and done research and written about the really criminal neglect of the Commissioner of Sewers in the metropolis in the 19th century, and the terrible neglect of the sanitation problems that the the metropolis then faced. I had absolutely no idea that these commissioners of sewers had such longevity. Almost certainly, these courts of sewers drew upon the experience of ancient indictments and the Crown Commissions that I've just been talking about, but also the practice of local bodies which had existed since the 13th century. When Henry of Bath led a commission to Romney March in 1257, for example, he found there a highly organised and vigorous body of 24 jurors which had been selected to maintain the defence and drainage of the marsh. Many other bodies existed, but the one at Romney Marsh was particularly important because it did provide the blueprint for the courts of sewers, which were set up under Tudor legislation. In keeping with the issues which have prompted such initiatives, the preamble of the 1531 statute laid out the concerns over the safety and preservation of the realm, which the Tudor state resolved to address. And it addressed it in the following terms: Know ye that for as much as the walls, ditches, banks, gutters, sewers, goats, cowses, bridges, streams, and other defences by the coast of the sea and marsh ground, by the rage of the sea flowing and reflowing, and by means of the trenches of fresh water descending and having course by diverse ways to the sea, be so disrupt, lacerate, and broken, and also the common passage of ships by impediments or annoyances be letted and interrupted, so that great and inestimable damage for the default of reparation of the said ditches, sewers, etc., in times past hath happened, and yet it is to be feared that greater hurt, loss, and damage is likely to ensue unless that speedy remedy be provided in that behalf. You can tell from this that Henry VIII was really quite determined to try and do something with a problem which had existed for centuries. In each area of the country, where thought necessary, and mostly within county boundaries, a minimum of 6, often more, justices were appointed, commissioners from among the ranks of local elites, by the Lord Chancellor. Originally they were appointed for a period of 3 years, although this was later extended to 10 in the early part of Elizabeth's reign. Commissioners were charged with responsibility for surveying the banks, ditches, sewers, bridges and mills, and so on within their domain, and then for compelling to be, quote, be made, repaired, amended, corrected, put down and reformed any damage or inadequacy found. The cost of such work was to be met by all persons in proportion to the quantity of land in their possession which was affected by the orders made. This is a key, this is a really important area, and one that led to endless contestation, as I'll come on to say. Any defaulters or debtors were to be punished by fines or, even more extreme circumstances, confiscation of their property and imprisonment. Commissions also had the power to make laws, ordinances and decrees and issue writs enforceable by sheriffs and bailiffs. To these ends, and to provide the Commission with the necessary judicial authority, county sheriffs were commanded to appoint a court of sewers comprising sufficient, normally 12, jurors who would inquire into matters brought by the Commission and ensure rightful execution of their orders, with due regard to the liberty of the subject enshrined in common law. The bulk of the work of the commissions, particularly in the routine surveying of the drainage networks, bridges and embankments, was thus performed by the jurors rather than the commissioners themselves. And most of these jurors, it has to be said, were local persons with freehold tenure who had little experience were illiterate and served their time unwillingly. Now, such a commission, such a court of sewers for the East Riding was established under the terms of the 1531 Act. Based at Beverley, the court had as its constituent divisions the three bailiwicks of Holderness and the wapentakes of Dickering, Bainton Beacon, Hunsley Beacon, Howdenshire, Ousendale, and Home Beacon, Wilton Beacon, and Helmsley Beacon. Each of these divisions had separate juries for inquiry, expenditure, and paining, which reported to the commissioners. Now, in complete contrast to the Crown Commissions, the Court of Sewers focused almost exclusively on the eastern region of the riding. Surviving records from the 17th are dominated by references to Holderness and Dickering. And I can only assume that this sort of imbalance, or this shift of emphasis towards the east, reflected a greater resolve to assume responsibility for the necessary work than for any urgency of need for improvements to the drainage of the respective regions. I can't, in other words, believe for a moment that somehow all the problems of the drainage in the western parts of the East Riding, particularly that around Howdenshire, had been sorted. Even when the eastern region decided to form its own court of sewers even when the western region decided to form its own court of sewers sometime between 1677 and 1699, comparative levels of endeavour didn't seem to change. From 1725 onwards, the records for the Howdenshire Court of Sewers are complete enough to build a reasonably reliable picture of how the Howdenshire Commission routinely operated. Given the longevity of the court and its authority over improvements in drainage, this record requires some consideration, brief though it might be. Commissioners were appointed from the ranks of local gentry. Prominent among them were members of the larger landowning families. Throughout the 18th century and well into the 19th century, for example, it was the Saltmarshes, the Scholefields, the Aythorpes who appeared time and again as the commissioners. And they displayed due diligence in public service by virtue of nigh continuous record of attendance at the monthly meeting of the commissioners. By contrast, jurymen were recruited from the rank and file of the farming community. Of the 19 jurors identified in 1834 for the Howden Division, over half were local farmers or innkeepers, the remainder being made up of shopkeepers, a bricklayer, and a schoolmaster. While commissioners could absent themselves from the monthly meetings, jurymen could not, and fines of up to 40 shillings were frequently levied for failures to attend. This considerable penalty didn't always guarantee compliance. Indeed, non-attendance clearly became something of a problem for the court. In September 1834, to take one instance, William Laverick, Michael White, Thomas Johnson, Thomas Leeton, Thomas Gowndile and Thomas Nottingham were all fined 20 shillings for non-attendance as a juryman at the last court. Now, despite the considerable powers exercised by the courts, their operations were limited and for the most part retroactive. Commissions acted only when they discovered defaults and annoyances in watercourses used for navigation or land drainage, or when petitions from local owners and occupiers of land cited instances of damage to their property. Such limitations, I think, were nicely illustrated by the Howdenshire Book of Pains in 1743, which listed the watercourses and embankments currently under pain, i.e. under the authority of the Court of Sewers. 12 specific instances of these orders are cited, including, typically, the sewer beginning at the east corner of the vessel, close at the north end of Normandy to Sandgap, be sufficiently cleansed and scoured at Lammas yearly, and so kept at all times in pain of every rood undone. One more, that the sewer from Flatgate End to Halegate End, this was in Howden itself, be made as deep as the back scut of the flow at the bottom of the bridges, as sufficiently broad on both sides with wood and stone, where required by Lammas next in pain of every rood undone. Before the list of general pains threatening action against any persons turning a drain or sewer out of its right course, in other words, diverting it for irrigation or whatever, failing sufficiently to repair and embank all flows adjoining upon the rivers Ouse and Derwent, or neglecting to repair any breached bank within 3 tides. For the most part, commissioners acted in response to petitions presented by owners and occupiers of land damaged by the failure to maintain drains and sewers in a fit state. Typical was that signed by 13 local landowners in January 1764. Showeth that a certain bank called Marsh Bank upon the marsh in Barnby upon the marsh within the parts aforesaid hath lately broken overflowed great part of your petitioners' grounds, and that they have sustained great damage by the breaking thereof. Another presented on the 19th of July 1808 by William Schofield and Philip Saltmarsh, proprietors of lands and ground at Saltmarsh, call for a more ambitious improvement, showeth that it would be very advantageous if a certain drain or sewer in Saltmarsh between Milking Lane and Cow Pasture, beginning at the Westfield and leading to Aldpate and so on to the Main Goat, also a certain other drain or sewer called Saltmarsh Main Goat, was severally taken out of pain, and a new clough of not less than same dimensions than the old one, and also a drain be made and cut as and where the same is now staked and set out. Sorry, I don't want to go on. It's a long quote, but the point here is what Saltmarsh and Schofield were suggesting were massive, and really quite considerable and expensive improvements to the drainage system, which clearly were going to be of enormous benefit to the land that they held. Such schemes, however, were at the very limits of the commissioners' ambitions. At no time did the commissioners contemplate plans to provide the sort of comprehensive drainage system which Howdenshire required, and which the Crown Commissioners had undertaken. Meetings routinely held reveal a body of the local gentry responding in a very piecemeal fashion to a variety of rather insignificant complaints about defects in the sewers, or settling disputes over payment for the repairs. Many meetings routinely considered only a few minor issues over the postponement of fines, some adjourned, having conducted no business whatsoever. This inertia may have rested in a complacence among large landowners, or a desire to minimise costly improvements, as was evident in the appalling record of neglect displayed by the Metropolitan Commissioners, for example. But the Commissioners, in fairness, faced systemic problems which could not be that readily surmounted. It often proved difficult, for example, to raise the necessary rates when large numbers of inhabitants were assessed, and township constables who had the inevitable task of collecting the payments were fined for failure to do so. Assessments were further complicated by the highly dispersed ownership of land adjacent to the important sewers. In an unusually ambitious move to improve Howden Main Drain in 1790, for example, the court identified no less than 32 owners with responsibility for lengths of the drain ranging from 1 to 34 roods. Under those circumstances, it was an extraordinarily difficult task for the commissioners, the Court of Sewers, to get all of these people to pay for the necessary work that was required. Arguably, the most challenging problem faced by commissioners derived from limitations placed upon their statutory power. Commissioners had the power to survey parts of the network of drains, etc., to order necessary repairs and to see them carried out satisfactorily. But as a matter of routine, they could not compel measures such as the cutting of new drain or the straightening of a river which interfered with private property. Only on, quote, great occasions of urgent public need and with the agreement of all affected landowners, which was a rare occurrence, could the powers of the commissioners be extended to enable such more ambitious works to be undertaken. Under these circumstances, it was virtually impossible for the commissioners to confront with due resolve the larger problems that impaired the drainage of land under their jurisdiction. I have to say, therefore, if I have to pass judgment on the Commission of Sewers, is that I wouldn't say they were derelict of their responsibilities, but they never really were in a position, they never really had the powers, and faced and that combined with the problems that they faced with dispersed land ownership, they could never really undertake the sorts of tasks that were really required. By way of an epilogue, I want to finish by saying something about what happened in the aftermath of the activities of the Commissioners of Sewers. I think over time the lack of will and the ineffectivity of the Commissioner of Sewers, not only Howdenshire but throughout the land, came to be recognised. And under those circumstances, and perhaps unsurprisingly, Parliament began to take a much more urgent and direct interest in the matter of land drainage. Throughout the 18th and 19th century, we see a long series of drainage acts passed by Parliament, which gave the necessary power to people who were driven to make what they considered to be necessary changes. As far as Howdenshire was concerned, the most important measure that was introduced by Parliament, or with the authority of Parliament, was the construction of the Martin Wheaton Canal, which for the first time really effectively provided a drainage to parts of Wallingfen. In the 19th century, significant improvements were made in the technology of drainage. Until that time, almost all land drainage had been on the surface. In the 19th century, the advances that were made encouraged much more underground drainage. So a really complex network of underground drainage systems were laid, often with the direct support of the state. a number of drainage land companies were formed in the second half of the 19th century, which provided loans to ambitious farmers to undertake such works. And that led, I think, to dramatic increases in the effectiveness of drainage. In the 20th century, immediately after the end of the First World War, we see the establishment of drainage and water boards who had the necessary power to undertake capital-intensive schemes of drainage. I wish I could say that as a result of these various initiatives in the 19th and 20th century, that the problems of land drainage in Howdenshire were effectively solved. Sadly, this was not the case. I think it's true to say that most of the worst excesses of inundation of water had solved. But any of you that are familiar with this terrain, particularly in winter, will not pass through without recognizing, without noting, that almost all the fields suffer from large standing areas of water for weeks, if not months, on end. So sadly, I have to conclude by saying that, well, important work has been done over the last millennia, but much important work remains to be done. I think on that note I better finish.
Well, thank you very much. Absolutely splendid to have a paper which moves across an entire millennium. Makes us all envious. May I be allowed a small footnote here, because those of you who were here a fortnight ago to hear my paper on Gilsig would have seen the way in which there was that enormous increase in the school's income in the late 18th century. And the curious connection is a lot of that increase came from the enclosure of Walling Fen. So my paper, that's a fortnight ago, has this real connection with your paper this week, which could never have been anticipated or contrived. But can I lob you a little gentle question to start? And that is to say, you've spoken about a sort of long period from the 12th century through to the 18th century where you have, it seemed to me, a sort of similar sort of agrarian economy.
Yeah.
What sort of land are we talking about at this period? Are we talking about land which is still wet and therefore only suitable for pastoral grazing? Or is this land which is sufficiently dry to be used for arable over this extended period?
Howdenshire land was very mixed in its nature. From an early time, it's quite clear that the majority of Howdenshire was marshland. There were, however, a few. I was going to say a few elevated areas, but when you're talking about elevated areas in Howdenshire, you're talking about areas which were a few feet above the marshland and were sort of isolated islands of relative dryness. I mean, if any of you know the area, I mean, you'll certainly know Howden Minster, for example, which was built upon one of these isolated islands. If you stand at Howden Minster and look around, you can see all the roads from Howden Minster are downhill. So from early time, I mean, you did have these isolated lands, but as the drainage of land improved, a lot of this land was systematically reclaimed, and you do have small settlements being created, and that did change the nature of farming activity. Around the Derwent and Ouse and Humber, you had lands here which were constantly being inundated with flood waters. Such lands were not entirely useless. I mean, they may not have been used for arable means, but they were vitally important lands for pasture during the dry seasons, and very valuable lands because of that. A bit further north you had the extended marshlands, common marshlands of Bishop Soil and Wallingfen, and it's interesting your example that you've given. I mean, although it was a marshland, I don't want to give the impression that this was wasteland. On the contrary, this was land which was a vital source of income and revenue for the local community. There were, before the enclosure of Wallingfen, almost all of the settlements in Howdenshire had a stake in Wallingfen. And when Wallingfen was subsequently, I mean, the enclosure of Wallingfen, which took place, was the most extraordinary complex piece of enclosure that you're likely to encounter. But with there was no doubt that with the improvement of the drainage of Wallingfen and Bishop Soil, a lot of that land was reclaimed and a lot of the land was improved, although there were pockets of marshland which remained. A bit further to the north, towards Spalding Moor, around Sandholm, the land was rather more sandy and drier, and that was used for mixed crops. So the land was very different in Howdenshire. It depended very much upon whether or not it had been drained effectively, whether or not, therefore, it was subject to constant inundation. It also was related, I have to say, to the question of warping. I don't know whether you are familiar with warping, but in the 17th century onwards, perhaps even before that in Howdenshire, this is an area which I need to spend a little more time on. Warping is the process of deliberately flooding your land by river water because of the rich alluvial deposits that the river leaves. So you flood the land with water, and then after a while you drain the water off, and you have left behind this level of silt, which is extraordinarily fertile. And that, to my mind, there are large areas of land proximate to Ouse and Derwent, which had been warped in this way for centuries, long before it became fashionable. And the early enclosure of that you see in Howdenshire, I think, is in part related to this. In part related to the fact that in order for warping to take place, you needed boundaries to be constructed, because you simply couldn't flood the whole of the land willy-nilly. So you had a very mixed picture. The crops that were grown, some wheat in the sandy areas, for the most part. Others you have root crops, potatoes, carrots. Flax was grown for a while around Howdenshire, because of the pasture land you had livestock kept, although mostly cattle, nothing like, and some sheep, but nothing like the sort of sheep that you had see in the highland areas of the Walworths nearby.